call the special ordinance committee meeting to order, October 4th. Can we start with a roll call?
Councilmember Jordan?
Here.
Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez?
Present.
Chair Snedden?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. And do we have any changes to the agenda or public commenters for items?
We do not.
Okay, thank you. With that, we will invite staff presentation.
Good afternoon, Ordinance Committee members. My name is Ellen Kokinda. I'm the Design Review and Historic Preservation Supervisor in the Planning Division. And I'm here to talk to you today about the Single Family Design Board membership. And I'm going to go over a brief history of the Single Family Design Board, review some of the recent challenges that we've had with membership and quorum, and then walk through our proposed ordinance amendments and answer any questions that you might have. So the Single Family Design Board actually didn't start as a board. It really started as the Neighborhood Preservation Ordinance. This ordinance was adopted in 1992 with single family design guidelines. So it established discretionary review for single family homes. And the concentration was really up in the hills because anything that could be seen from down on the, in the lower areas and up, there was special attention to preserving the neighborhoods and trying to create a discretionary process to do design review for those homes. And at the time, the Architectural Board of Review, their purview was expanded in order to include single unit residences. So that went on for quite a while, but it wasn't until 2007 when the Single Family Design Board was actually created. So at the time, the Architectural Board of Review, ABR, was having meetings every single Monday night. So they were responsible for multi-unit projects, non-residential projects, and single homes. So the Single Family Design Board not only was able to relieve the ABR of some of the development review or the design review projects, but it was really established, this board was established after a 3-year process in 2007 to look at neighborhood compatibility in particular, in that we were seeing quite a lot of McMansions being built, particularly along Shoreline Drive, and this 3-year process was to try to address some of that McMansionization and again try to maintain and continue to establish that neighborhood preservation and compatibility. So there were the updates to the ordinance. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the more recent and acute challenges that we're having with the Single Family Design Board. One is being member recruitment. So as you're familiar, the city clerk's office does all the recruitment for the city's advisory boards, but the planning division and our department do a lot on the back end for recruitment. We seek out qualified candidates, we reach out to them, we reach out to all of our networks in the development and design review, architect community, and our planners. Again, just to see if we can't garner more interest and support and to see if we can't get good applications before the city council. So as we do that, I've had a lot of conversations on the back end, and what I've learned is that we are there's a challenge with recruitment because the city has 4 design review boards in and of themselves, but there are other design review boards across the county. There's the Montecito Design Review Board, there's one in Goleta, there's maybe 1 or 2 more in the county. So the pool of applicants and qualified applicants begins to shrink when you start to look at all of those different design review boards, and just the excessive amount of time and the type of request that we're asking of people is quite a bit, and you know what it takes in order to serve and do public service. So we've had some recent recruitment issues and just trying to get the numbers up for applications. Secondly, we've had some retention issues. Most recently, this was just a couple of months ago, we had board member Brentlinger resign after only 6 months of tenure on the Single Family Design Board. So what that means is in June, we had to ask Chair Miller to stay on, even though his term was up, in order to make sure that we wouldn't lose quorum and that we wouldn't be struggling with that as much as we have. But retention, again, I just want to acknowledge the challenge it is to get people to help facilitate their wanting to be here and to make it a pleasurable experience. And in that particular case, there was some time challenges and misunderstandings about what the commitment actually was. We've also had some meeting quorum issues, and related to that, the different qualifications of the single-family design board. So within the last 2 months, I've had to cancel 2 single-family design board meetings. So that takes about 10 projects each. And not only that, but as we've had to cancel those because of a lack of quorum, we were also having to schedule special meetings because the demand for projects is so high, and we're asking a lot of our board members to be there. So, I mean, you can imagine if one person's ill or if one person has to step down due to a conflict of interest, it's been really difficult. And not only does that put a strain on our applicants, but homeowners who are just trying to do simple additions or different projects to their homes. It's really unfair, and they pay quite a bit of money to go through our process and then to be pushed out months and months before they can even get on a board. That's it's a major disadvantage. And I just want to point out on this slide the disadvantage it is to our single-family design board members as well. There's such a heavy caseload that they have to review, and the different delays to development that they haven't necessarily had the proper training that they need. Most boards that come before us, we do intermittent trainings, whether it's legislative, whether it's process training, because you can't just come on a board and instantly know how things work. It takes time, it takes experience, and those intermittent trainings really help to develop the person, because we know it's a commitment, and it's an asset to have someone on our boards, and we want to make sure that they feel supported. So unfortunately, I'm going to be really honest with you that I think our single-family design board has suffered a little bit because I haven't been able to add trainings to their schedule, and that's because I've been prioritizing development projects and the applicants who go through our process. And then also you'll notice on the screen that I do call out in-person requirement, which we know the Brown Act, we're limited by kind of what the state requires in terms of participation, but when it comes to recruitment, and we have a lot of working professionals who work full-time, as you all are also familiar, that it's difficult to, it's a lot to request, not only the full board meetings that start at 3 o'clock and often go well into the evening, but then there's also consent review that happens at 11 a.m. on Monday, every Monday. So by just having to be in the building, it's pulling away time from their other professional lives. So these are some of the immediate challenges that we're facing, and kind of why it's just been so stressful for my staff, and every other Monday not necessarily knowing of whether or not we're going to make quorum, which is kind of an awful feeling in terms of, again, just having to communicate that to applicants and members of the public who are expecting to show up and participate. So our existing requirements for membership, this is in Title 22 of our code. We have, the code calls out 7 members of the Single Family Design Board. They have to be members of Santa Barbara County. The qualifications, 2 licensed architects, 1 licensed landscape architect, 3 persons with professional qualifications, and then 1 representative who's the public at large. What we're asking for today for consideration for the proposed ordinance amendments is to not only reduce the total number of board members, and that's just to address some of the just the recruitment challenges of getting enough to begin with, reducing the quorum requirements so we're not struggling every other Monday to meet quorum and just be able to hold a meeting. And then we're asking to modify our board member qualifications and quorum requirements, again, so that we can meet quorum as it is. And we have already proposed this idea to the city's land development team oversight subcommittee. And they were supportive of it, and they didn't necessarily know all the details at the time, but they also called out being able to fast track this, and that's why we're here today. And it's not necessarily with our parallel efforts for single family design board, looking at other items to address and reduce the total number of projects, but we're fast tracking this. And so what we're proposing is to reduce the board from 7 members to 5, and to keep that they need to be residents of Santa Barbara County, that only 3 members would constitute a quorum instead of 4, and that as part of that quorum, we no longer would require a licensed architect to be part of that quorum, but the qualifications we're looking for, at least 3 members need to possess professional qualifications, so that could be in the field of architecture, building design, structural engineering, industrial design, and landscape design. And then up to 2 members appointed from the public at large. So it's a fairly simple change. Again, it's reducing the number of, total number of board members, making it so that quorum is 3 people, that we're not necessarily identifying who needs to be part of the makeup of quorum, that we don't need a licensed architect for that 3-person quorum. And that, again, you've got the different professional qualifications as outlined in public at large. So that is the presentation, short and sweet. If you have any questions, I'm here to answer. We also have Tava Ostringer here, and I just want to acknowledge that we have Vice Chair Kalas here from the Single Family Design Board, and thank you for being present. I don't know if she wants to speak today, but just want to acknowledge her presence.
Thank you so much for presentation. And with that, we have questions from the committee. Councilmember Jordan?
Thank you. I think you answered this easy one first. In your proposal, a licensed architect would fit into the professional category, right?
That's correct. It's not excluding, to Councilmember Jordan, it's not excluding an architect, a licensed architect. It's just saying that we don't have to seek one out in order to have quorum or be on the board.
And then would somebody that I would call a planner fit into that category too? I'll just use her name because she's retired, Suzanne Elledge, somebody like that. Would that fall into the professional category and not have to fall into the public category?
I think it depends on how that person applies. I think in her case, she could probably apply for either. She has an extreme amount of professional experience and qualifications and understands the nuances. And so that's how, I don't know if Ms. Ostringer wants to add anything to that. And we'd probably have to look at it individually as they apply.
Chair Sned and Councilmember Jordan, the language is to building design, structural engineering. If you wanted to be a little bit broader, I could just simply add the word planning professional in there.
Okay. Any reason either of you would think that's a bad idea?
Chair Sned, and through you to Councilmember Jordan. No, I actually think that I think the most important thing about single-family design board is really trying to understand what is it to be a neighbor, and I think a lot of it is common sense, and I think planners are able to understand the big picture stuff. They understand the types of projects when there might be a land use decision or approval that's also required that they need to weigh in on, at least from the aesthetic standpoint. So I think it's perfectly appropriate for a planner to be part of the board.
Good planners anyhow, right? Yeah. And then could you or someone talk a little bit about what happens in staff process prior to a project showing up in the public single-family design board? What review, what type of, what type of stuff are we looking for? So where I'm going with this is I see a lot of conversations at single-family design board that could have taken place, not at single-family design board, outside of, I mean, if we had staff, if we had whatever, if we had an architect, a staff architect or whatever. But so could you talk a little bit about how my application gets in front of the single-family design board? What takes place first?
Yes, Chair Sned, and through you to Councilmember Jordan. So all of our projects, no matter what discretionary review, go through application completeness. And what that means is the applicant submits their application. We route it to all the different city divisions, departments, as it's identified. There's not every project. I mean, if you have a small project, that doesn't need to go across the city. But let's say you have a new residence that's proposed. That would be submitted to all the different, routed to all the different city reviewers. They provide input and identify if they have enough information to deem the project complete. And when something is deemed complete, that means we can schedule it for project design approval. And so oftentimes we will schedule a project at Single Family Design Board before it's complete, and that's just to get initial concept review on the design, where basically not much is going to change. There aren't any big issues, but at least the board members can weigh in on the aesthetics of it and neighborhood compatibility and get that those initial comments, and then they realize, or the applicant will then resubmit with all the information needed, and once we have that complete application, that's when it's scheduled for project design approval and then later final approval. And so that might answer the question regarding kind of what the process is. So that is a little different than what we used to do. We used to just put projects on, and so we really try to avoid late hits. So now we do a much more robust zoning review. So we don't want anybody to get through the design review process and then have something come up later, like, oh, you need this, you need a modification or something else. So that's why it's a little bit more time intensive up front, but the idea is by the time you get your approval, you're moving through the building permit process much faster.
So I'm spoiled, of course, with a different background. So, right? So what I see is sometimes just a paragraph on a staff report and then a set of plans, whereas just go back to a planning commission that frequently morphs also into design and compatibility and also land use, of course. There's pages and pages and pages of this and that and recommendations and compatibility with goals and general plan and stuff like that. And then so just comparing that in perspective, then I see a lot of those type of discussions that potentially were addressed in a planning commission type staff report take up time, hours of time at the Single Family Design Board in particular. And so that's just a resource decision that we've made, right? Not to put together greater staff reports with more background, with recommendations, with aligning with goals, not aligning with goals, whatever it may be.
Chair Sneddon, through you, Councilmember Jordan. So yes, that's correct. We do not do staff reports for single-family projects, and one is that there's not always necessarily a need for it. The Single-Family Design Board has findings that they have to make in order to approve those, and those are the neighborhood preservation findings that are in the neighborhood preservation ordinance, and they have a lot to do with, again, some mass, bulk, and scale, but is it compatible with the neighborhood, or in terms of the scale, the design? So there's a certain level of expertise that a comfort level that as professionals that they're looking for, and again, as if you're a member of the public at large, does it pass the test of like, would I be okay living next door to this, and then being able to articulate and make those findings. And again, I think some of that is some of the training that the board has missed out on. But on the whole, they do this every other week, and they've gotten to be quite comfortable with it, and there's always room for more support. But in terms of the staff report, we provide guidance and much more when it has to do with a land use decision, and that they have to weigh in on the aesthetics of, let's say, a modification, or a project first starts out at the Single Family Design Board for comments, but then has to go to the Planning Commission for a coastal development permit. So it's not always necessary to provide that additional, the land use approvals are not as pertinent to the single-family design board in many instances, so we don't necessarily need to provide all that background. We're asking them to kind of, to look at the aesthetics and compatibility with other.
Speaking, just a couple, I'll try and state questions, but speaking to findings, so I'm just going to compare again one type of board to another. In the Planning Commission, pages and pages are written about, finding, page of narrative, how it fits, how it doesn't fit, the level of comfort staff has. You can read between the lines and get from that. Not so with single-family design boards. They just have these findings, but they don't have a staff report or something from staff to lead them through the nuances of, kind of fits in the peg of this finding, kind of doesn't, is questionable, can be supported by staff, that doesn't exist. Again, I think I'm just kind of talking overall resources available to the process, right?
And Chair Stone, through you to Councilmember Jordan, what I do want to acknowledge is that we have a tremendous amount of materials and support. Generally, that is more geared towards the applicant, for the applicant to say, to what extent is your project meeting all of the single-family design guidelines? We've got pages and pages of guidelines. Here's how we've extracted them. We've created handouts for you so that you can walk through and you can articulate to the single-family design board how you think your project meets it. So staff has taken a little, staff doesn't direct the board in that way, and historically we haven't had that architectural expertise to do that. But we do on the back end, if we see a project that is really different from all the neighboring homes, or we think is going to be controversial, we try to give that applicant some upfront info and, again, some guidance, and they can choose whether or not they want to continue and bring a project before the board that could potentially be really controversial or have other issues. So our work is really much more geared to trying to help the applicant in their articulation.
Okay. Then I'm trying hard not to lob up an easy softball for Mr. Sweeney, but we have had input and discussions in the past about having a staff architect and what benefits that would be. And if we're now, according to your proposal, potentially reducing the requirements for a sitting architect to be on there, potentially based on who makes decisions up here, you could literally not have an architect on the board. Is that a consideration to be talked about in the longer-term discussions and considerations that are going on with boards and commissions on whether what are the pros and cons of having a staff architect to help with this process?
Chair Sneddon, through you to Councilmember Jordan. So let me take this in two pieces. And first I want to say a little bit more about the makeup of the single-family design board, and it is in order to submit for a building permit, you do not need to be a licensed architect for single-family residences. And actually, our chair, Chair Miller of the Single-Family Design Board, is not a licensed architect, but he served on the board for 10 years. And they've got, the people who are serving have a considerable amount, years and years of experience, and I think they are very comfortable, and it's just a particular type of licensure, and I don't want to necessarily, I'm just talking about single-family design board here, so I don't want to, I'm not opening this conversation up for HLC or ABR. I think that's a totally different conversation, but in regards to single-family homes, I do not think it's necessary, and I think that we've got people with years of experience who are able to design homes themselves and go through the whole process without requiring that licensure, and again, who I think can apply their expertise to being able to make the findings of neighborhood compatibility.
I just, before you go to the second part about pros and cons, can you call yourself an architect without being licensed?
No, to call yourself an architect, that's a specific type of licensure.
And then, so as you describe a non-architect, how would that person fit into or qualify in the professional category the way you're proposing?
Well, there's, in terms of building design, that might be one of them.
Okay.
We've got a lot of just designers, interior designers, people, the number of projects that we see that are accessory dwelling units that don't meet the ministerial design criteria and are then kind of moved over into discretionary review. You don't need to be a licensed
So
architect
it's more
for
of
that.
a resume than a license number with the state of California.
Yes, I would say that.
And then, could you briefly talk about what the discussions we've had in the past about having a staff architect and the pros and the cons? Are there pros even?
Chair Snedden, through you, I'm going to be very honest and say that I too was hoping to see more someone with more architecture background, even in the design review supervisor position. And I know that it was really difficult to find someone with architecture background who accepted the position. And I myself studied architecture and urban design, and I have my master's. But again, I don't have that licensure, and it's a very different thing. And but I think in terms of overall recruitment, that really ties into the national challenges of recruitment and what you're looking for. And it's hard to get people to apply for these things. And so that position was left open, and I don't think the types of candidates with those qualifications went for it. And yes, it would be, I think it's much more helpful. I think we have to look at, I think we have to have a stronger eye as staff to be able to, again, point applicants in the right direction. But I just want to acknowledge that staff will never necessarily step in and replace someone who is necessarily a licensed architect in some regards.
Last question, I just can never remember. Are we working on objective, single-family residence design guidelines?
Chair Snedden, through you, Councilmember Jordan. So this particular request is fast tracking. We have a parallel effort that is looking to reduce the overall number of design review triggers and expand administrative approvals. So that would be expanding what staff would be able to approve. That is going to be an 8 to 10 month process that we did share with the Land Development Team Oversight Subcommittee on August 18th. And acknowledging that we will be reaching out to former SFDB board members as well as current SFDB board members and other members in our development and architect AIA community, as well as different members of the public, and that's to get their input on. Just want to acknowledge that SFDB has twice as many projects as HLC and ABR. So it's a tremendous amount of staff time and a tremendous amount of work and burden that we put on our board. So what are the things that we might be able to, maybe when I say let go of, again, things that we could still have some oversight but just expand staff approvals so that they don't have to go to a public hearing and that they don't have to, that they're not burdened with this long drawn out process for a single family home. And then reducing the number of triggers overall. So not even requiring any, that it would just go straight to building permit. And those are the things that you can imagine, things that won't be seen from the public view. And so all of that conversation is happening in parallel, and so we're building up on that. And I look forward to being back here with more ordinance amendments on that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilmember Jordan. I do want to be mindful of time. This meeting is scheduled to end in 15 minutes, which I'm going to say right now I don't think is enough time for, it was scheduled for 12 to 12:45 because we have a closed session at 1. So if we don't get through it, it is important to answer these questions. They're excellent questions, and I think we all have questions. But if we don't get through it, I do want to reserve that we may not make a quick decision today, just based on the scheduling. So, Councilmember Gutierrez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just skip my questions so we can get to public comment.
Are you sure? I think questions, well, okay, I have a couple.
Most of my questions were asked by Councilmember Jordan anyway.
Okay. I'll ask some questions, and if it's important that we make the time for decision making. So one question is just a factual question. Because this isn't a charter committee, can we have flexibility with quorum? And I'm not suggesting we do this, but could we have 7 members but have the quorum be 3? Or is that quorum number fixed?
Chair Snedden, a quorum is a majority of the board. So as we've drafted it, we, instead of putting the fixed number, it's based on the majority appointed. So if we had the problem we have now where we have 5, it reduces the quorum to 3.
Thank you. And then, so just for the excessive amount of time, and Councilmember Jordan asked the questions about what more could be done on the front end or at the counter or ministerially, so that's been answered. But other questions I have is, could moving to an online format help, especially for professionals who are making time for these meetings, or moving the time of them? Do we have issues with term limits? You know, if someone is really interested in continuing to serve, could we hold on to them? And if there's more we could be doing to help with that recruitment? Is there anything with the scheduling that, you know, not having separate consent agendas, but looping it in with the main meeting, but flexibility or any input on that end of it that might retain?
Chair Snedden, great question. And I think there is a lot I'm sure we could look into, and I think that I wouldn't want to make assumptions. I definitely want to reach out to board members themselves to answer some of those. But I think one challenge in terms of recruitment, I think that there's always the having to re-up or go back and do additional interviews after you've already served. Clearly, it's less of an issue for single-family design board, but you might, you know, this is very different for HLC and ABR, where there are different pieces of the puzzle that you as council are trying to look into. In terms of timing, I think that's a great question for what works for working professionals. I think I can't say for sure, but it's awkward when you have to be at consent at 11 and then back at 3, so you're kind of coming and going to 630 Garden Street. I think that's challenging. I want to acknowledge that we're somewhat limited by the Brown Act, and I'm looking to Ms. Ostringer, and you know, I think that if we had more flexibility with remote, that could change the number of people who could potentially be interested. But I think that recruitment is definitely, like, I don't necessarily see that challenge going away anytime. We have people who've served on our advisory boards for many, many years, who have that experience, who know to kind of understand the importance of civic engagement. It's a tremendous amount of time, and again, that's one of the reasons we're looking at this parallel effort to reduce the number of projects, to say what is the most important piece that we think as a city is that we want to make sure that we're still preserving and that it still honors all of the work that's done in the past, and that, again, where we might be able to let go of so that we could just simply reduce the number of projects and the demand that we have on our board members. And I know that there were some other ideas in there that you mentioned, if I didn't respond to them.
No, I think that covers it. I mean, you'd have to poll the existing members or past members for what might make it more accommodating to continue to serve. And I'll say for myself, I haven't done my part in extra efforts of recruitment because I didn't realize we were on the verge of downsizing in this way too. So let's take public comment.
Chair Snedden, if I may, I just wanted to make a couple quick points. I apologize for interrupting. I just wanted to point out that the ordinance sets the floor, not the ceiling, with regards to who you can appoint, with regards to the 3 professionals. So you could get several architects that you would want to choose from, and that gives you the flexibility. There's also an idea that was floating around. Ms. Bjork just mentioned it to me. You could have a board of 5 with 2 alternates. So if someone couldn't make it, your alternate could come in. I do just want to point out to the committee that you are in the process of recruiting. So right now we're set at 7, but if we're thinking about going down to 5, that's just something to keep in mind.
Thank you. With that, let's have our public comment. First is Leslie Colas.
Ms. Snedden, Mr. Jordan, Mr. Gutierrez. I sent a letter in, so I don't really want to be redundant with the letter that I'm assuming you've received, and I hope you've reviewed that. I'm currently serving as vice chair, and I'm not here to speak for the board at large, but rather for myself in terms of the ordinance before you or the changes to the ordinance. I can support a 5-member committee or board. I could support lowering quorum to 3. But I think it's very important that we retain the professional qualifications for the board members. And more, it seems like we really need 2 licensed landscape architects on the board. We've had some issues with the current landscape architect having to recuse herself on occasions because of conflicts of interest. And that puts the board at a disadvantage in terms of reviewing projects related to screening elements, privacy issues that could be resolved with landscape. I don't know how tall a tree grows or how bushy a bush will get and whether it's going to impede somebody's view. So I really have to depend on a landscape architect's expertise for something of that nature. And when that board member has to recuse herself, we're in a position where we don't have anybody with that expertise to do so. So I would encourage you to increase that requirement on the board rather than reduce it. I would question the general language that's being proposed in the ordinance in terms of professional qualifications. I don't know how you can, without some sort of objective criteria, decide that somebody is in fact qualified. It's a little bit hard, right? Like, well, this person's kind of worked in the industry for 5 years, and so I think they're good to go. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. There are a lot of very qualified building designers around, and there are many who aren't. So I think that's going to create difficulty for you as a council later in terms of making that decision. There are a couple of things that I'll just throw out there as information for staff as well as yourself. I think we're seeing a lot of pools being built, and for some reason these are coming to our board. This is not something that's going to create a view issue for somebody. It might create some privacy or noise issues, but it seems like something that could be ministerially reviewed, and that would remove those projects from our consent calendar, and that would open up space for maybe some of the items on the full board to be moved to consent. There are several projects that have come before us where we've caught trees that have been removed proactively by applicants without proper permits, and I understand that staff does their best to go out and take a look at sites, review projects, but the reality is that our board does provide another level of review that staff just doesn't have the bandwidth for, I think. And that's included, major oaks that have been removed, cut. I had a project just the other day where a huge elm tree, it looked like it had about a 30-inch trunk on it, had gotten removed, and it wasn't documented on drawings. So these are some of the value that we add to projects in terms of our review process. One of the other things that we find ourselves doing more and more is educating the neighbors about what is and is not allowed in their neighborhoods. There have been a lot of changes in the last 2 or 3 years or 4 years in our city and the state. And we recently had a project where I think about 20 neighbors showed up, and they were really upset. And one of the neighbors made a comment, "I don't understand how this is happening in a single-family zone. How are we getting a 2-story ADU that is 1,200 square feet?" And really, it took us to turn to them and explain there really is no single-family zone left anymore, because everybody can have an ADU. Everybody can have a secondary unit on their parcel. And that was a shock to them. So clearly I know there have been great attempts to educate the city and the public about that, but it is still a role that we are informally playing on your behalf, frankly. I think really those are the main points that I wanted to make. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you. I want to take this opportunity to thank you for your service, especially as we're hearing that it's so hard to find. So thank you, and thank you for your comments. Do you have any questions for? No.
One thing you may consider in terms of recruitment, if you don't mind, is reaching out to those who are qualified that work in institutional settings, The university might be an opportunity for that. I used to project manage at the university. Many people are there are credentialed, and they have a little bit more flexibility oftentimes, so that may be an opportunity for recruitment.
Thank you. And if you think of other ideas, please do let us know. Next speaker is Fred Sweeney.
Thank you, Madam Chair Sneddon and Council Gutierrez and Jordan. I'm here again because you know this is one of my favorite subjects. First of all, I want to say I'm encouraged by Ms. Kokenda and her work as I've been observing it. It's starting to lift things out. One of the things I find, I sent you a letter and I won't go into the details of the letter, but one of the things that alarmed me about this proposal is a perception of the delusion of the board. I'm concerned that dropping the requirement for licensed professionals will do exactly that. You know, for a long time, I've always made the argument that this board is the single A club of, and not the major leagues, okay? And I think there's a perception in the community because these meetings turned out to be kind of, in some cases, planning commission meetings, because it is, for many people, the only public hearing you will get for a project being built in your neighborhood. And so they're assuming that we have the support and resources that the HLC does, because that's what most people see in this community as the power behind what things look like. And that's not the case here. Most everything that comes to the ABR and the HLC is done by a licensed professional as required by state law. And as Ms. Kokenda already pointed out, that's not the case of the Single Family Design Board. So we get any and all comers. And a lot of times the community doesn't understand that, the applicant doesn't understand that, and the novice applicant is thoroughly confused. They don't understand the process. They don't know what PDA is. You know, we like to use initials. They don't have a clue that project design approval is a key element for moving a project forward at all three boards. People don't realize that. There's a big educational component for the public when they show up at these meetings. And as Ms. Kloss pointed out, you get 20 or 30 people in the audience who are just fuming because they don't understand what's going on, and particularly because of the changes in the state law. It was interesting. I've gone through the Novak report many times now, and I'm still trying to figure out how did we arrive at their suggestion that we eliminate the board. Couldn't find it even in the anecdotal comments that they included in the report. So I think what's important here is you as a council need to decide, is single-family residential projects required to be reviewed for neighborhood compatibility? And remember, neighborhood compatibility right now is a very, very subjective decision at Single-Family Design Board. There is no definition. And so that's very challenging. And if your decision is that isn't important to this city, then abolish the board, get rid of it. Let ABR and HLC continue with their good work, but if you're going to keep this, then it has to have a much more robust support system. Because these things act like planning commission and city council meetings. And if you've observed any of them, particularly when we have a controversial project created because neighbors don't understand what's going on, or we have the barking dog issue, which is typical of these kinds of projects. So the training is imperative. A smaller board is perfectly fine at 5, but you need to give training for the chair to be able to control these kinds of meetings. When I was first doing it, I was chair for 6 years of the 10 years that I served. I called the city attorney's office because we had belligerent people in the meeting. I said, what am I supposed to do? I was advised that, oh, you do have the authority to shut the meeting down or ask for the police to come in or whatever. Well, that was a learning experience. I was never trained or told about that from the very beginning as being chairman. So this board has to confront very different issues than HLC and ABR, where you're dealing mostly with professional folks, professional planners, licensed architects, et cetera. This board acts very differently, so negating the ability to have licensed architects on this board is going to be really damaging. And then to the point, last point, to the staff architect. That's a double-edged sword, because you can create a staff architect czar whose personality will then dictate how people perceive things. That's probably not a good thing. On the other hand, it supplements a lot of what Ms. Kokenda said, is that not everyone on the staff is able to ascertain, read drawings, understand what's being proposed, et cetera. That's a skill set that is very hard to acquire. And so this is going to be challenging, but I think that's your big decision. Do you want single-family homes to be reviewed? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sweeney, and thank you also for your years of service. So it is now to the committee. We are,
Chair Sneddon, we do have one individual
we
online
do.
who would like to speak on this item.
let's hear from public comment online.
Richard Clausen, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Rick Clausen. I am not licensed or certified in any way that's appropriate to SFDB, but I've been listening to the discussions, and I have 4 points, 4.5 points. First of all, because anybody can submit a plan to the SFDB, but not be an architect, I think that should mean that in every instance, an architect definitely needs to be part of the approval process. I think it's great that non-architects can draw their own drawings. I actually did that once for a small little interior thing for myself here at my home. But architects play a role, and there should not be a project that is drawn and designed by a non-architect and then approved without an architect's oversight. Secondly, I was surprised that SFDB has twice the caseload of HLC and ABR. And actually, I'm only surprised because what's before you now is a recommendation to reduce the staff and reduce the membership and reduce the quorum requirements for this board that has double the caseload of the other two boards. That was weird. Third, I think when you're considering quorum, that the driver on that discussion, on that decision, must be what eyes do we want to approve projects? And then you set the quorum to meet that number, not the other way around, which is right now, for convenience or expediency, the staff recommendation is that we do something to the quorum number. I think that shortchanges the public. I think that the main consideration should be who do we need and what qualifications do we need looking at projects, and then set your quorum according to that. Fourth, with due respect to AC Astringer, I think if she's suggesting that the ordinance says that the SFDB's quorum should be X, then change the ordinance. You're the ordinance committee. Change that. Don't be bound by an ordinance that no longer fits. I mean, that's exactly what you're doing now. You're changing the ordinance to fit what works. So I think you need some better information on what are your options to deal with the quorum issue, rather than just be told, oh, well, the ordinance says we have to have this, a majority quorum. Because neither, as I wrote in my letter, neither Roberts nor Rosenberg's rules require that. And then finally, just on a lighter note, to edify the committee and Mr. Sweeney, the public's understanding of PDA is public displays of affection. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Clausen. And is that closes public comment? Okay, so we'll close the public comment portion of the meeting. If we are in agreement and can make a decision in the next 3 minutes, but if there's further discussion, I think this warrants holding it over. We've closed public comment, not reopen, but open to discussion at this point. We'll give it 2 minutes. I can make my comments.
Well,
Councilmember Jordan.
as suggested, I'm not satisfied. So I have other suggestions, which I don't, and so I think we just ought to hold it over.
Okay.
I have a whole page of suggestions and comments to make, so I think we should come back and discuss this.
As do I. Thank you. So I think that is proper to give it the space and time it needs to weigh this decision further. We will leave it to City Clerk to decide for us when we can bring this back.
I'll work with the department to make sure. We do have an item next week at Ordinance Committee, so I don't want to double up. I want to give this item enough time.
Yes.
But we could change the time of ordinance next week to start earlier, so
Okay.
I'll
We'll
get back to
trust
you.
that you'll work
Yeah.
the schedule, and thank you very much for commenting and for the item. Thank you.